Hello, hello. Hope everyone's having a great day today. Welcome to this Procurement Leaders webinar on collaborative mindsets and capabilities, how the supplier's perspective will reshape ways of working, which is a very interesting and important topic that I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about today and hearing from a great panel of speakers that we have here on the line. Thank you, first of all, for HICX for partnering with us on this important and very timely topic, like I said. My name is Niko Nurmi. I'm an executive advisor at Procurement Leaders, and I'll be your host today. You'll hear most of your insights from our great panelists, whom I'll introduce you in just a second. But before that, just a couple of housekeeping points to get to first. Sorry, just bear with me as I move the slides. There we go. So, first of all, what we'll be discussing today in quite a lot of detail is a new Voice of the Supplier report from HICX. So you'll find that as an additional resource from the webinar platform. So clickety-click on that and find more information there. You can also just submit questions to our panelists throughout the session. So just use the Q&A function that you'll see on the same page there on your platform. We'll obviously also very much want to kind of continue improving our product here. So if you have any feedback on this, please fill the survey that we'll send to you kind of at the end of the session. And also, hopefully you don't need this, but if indeed you have any technical difficulties at any point of the session, there's a help function there or help button there that you can click to get some technical assistance from the Procurement Leaders team. I think I covered most of the housekeeping points there, so it's my pleasure to introduce to you our panel today. So, like I said, my name is Niko Nurmi. I'm joined here by Anthony from HICX, Manikandan from Schneider Electric, and then Rich from Acada. But rather than me telling you about these guys, I'll let them introduce themselves to you themselves. So first of all, Mani, could you just give us a little bit of information about your background and some of the projects that you're currently working on? And then also, in line with the discussion that we're having here today, why is the supplier perspective and kind of supplier experience really important to you in your role at Schneider Electric?
Hello, everyone. My pleasure to join this webinar today. I head the digital transformation for procurement at Schneider Electric. I'm in charge of the overall digital strategy and deployment of new technologies, driving new way of working. So in the last few years, I led the project on digital supplier interaction, deploying technology platforms across several business processes, facing suppliers. The main objective was to achieve simplification and efficiency at both ends, the buyer and the supplier, plus to strengthen relationship massively with suppliers across the organization, across all levels, resulting into high level of collaboration and satisfaction. So keeping the suppliers at the core and valuing their perspective was essential for me.
Perfect. Good to have you on the panel here today, Mani. Rich, over to you. A bit of information about yourself, and then also why do we have you here to talk about supplier perspectives?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Rich Sains. I'm a procurement leader turned software founder. So I was head of IT procurement for a number of years, many FTSE 100 firms across different sectors. And I founded Acada to help procurement to be busy on the right things. So our software helps procurement leaders to manage their pipeline, prioritize the most strategic of activities, and then offload the rest through self-service and measuring reporting KPIs that the CPO cares about. The rising importance of the supplier's perspective. I think business has really entered a relationship era, and it's complex times. Relationships are key, and procurement has traditionally been very process-centric and largely ignored the supplier's perspective. And I think that's not going to work in this new era. So we need new skills and new ways of working to benefit and prosper. So something that I'm very passionate about.
Excellent to hear. 100% agree with everything that you said there. And Anthony, I'm pretty sure you agree as well. Could you just give us a quick glimpse into your role at HICX, and then also why, as a company, HICX has been very keen to address this topic of supplier perspectives?
Yeah, definitely, Nico, and thanks very much for the intro. So yeah, we do agree with Rich, very much so. So my role at HICX, I look after the marketing function, been here for about 3 years, and I've got a background in B2B technology marketing from a number of different sectors, quite often related to supply chain, retail and procurement. Why are we here, I guess, or why are we keen to address this topic? Well, Rich touched on it, but I think at its core, and we're going to spend more time on this, but at its core, HICX's view is that focusing on the supplier experience and putting the supplier's success, if you like, at the heart of buy-side strategies, we reckon it's a terrific opportunity for serious competitive advantage. You really can boil it down into those few words. It's a very obvious, a cliche now that companies rely on their suppliers, but like all good cliches, it's a cliche because it's true. And I think the last few years have reinforced this more than ever before, that companies, manufacturing companies in particular, but across all sectors, rely completely on their suppliers for their success, for their future, for their very existence. And so putting the supplier at the heart of what you're doing and thinking about their experience, we just think is a no-brainer. And so we're really excited by the topic and looking forward to getting stuck into a discussion.
Excellent. Yeah, definitely. Bit of a changing landscape within procurement. I think we know from our own research here at Procurement Leaders, from our strategic planning guide for 2023, for example, that cost savings for the first time, well, pretty much ever, isn't the biggest priority for CPOs going forward. And it's more important to tackle things like, scarcity of materials, for example. So being in good terms with your suppliers is certainly helping with that. So we'll definitely get to discussing some of this today. So here's broadly the topics of conversation today: what suppliers really think is really important in creating a bleeding edge supplier experience, the importance of collaboration and how to strengthen ways of working together, and then also what enterprises need to do today to really ready themselves for this new era. So you will have heard from all of the panelists already that they will certainly have some interesting points to share on this, and I really want to get us stuck into the conversation. So let's maybe start with you, and could you just perhaps set the scene a bit about this Voice of the Supplier report that you recently published? Kind of like, how did that come about, and what kind of been your, I guess, objective behind putting this report together?
Yeah, absolutely, Nico. So as I said earlier, we at HICX, obviously we're a software vendor and we have some software to sell, but that's not what today's about. But we could see in talking to major organizations like Mondelez, Unilever, Mars, indeed Manny at Schneider, that there was this shift starting to happen. Organizations recognized that it wasn't just about, driving the supplier down to the lowest possible price and just extracting from the supplier, but it was about sort of mutual value generation. So we observed this shift beginning, say, 2 years ago, roughly. And actually, a year ago, we ran a survey asking very large organizations about their views on this. Like, to what extent do you care about the supplier experience? Where do you think opportunities for improve exist? But it also occurred to us that, like, if we're talking about supplier experience, then and the focus on the supplier, then it kind of rather begs the question: what the hell do they think? They're not passive participants in this debate. They're half the relationship. And so it seemed to be a very big gap in the market generally, which is a lack of understanding at the supplier level about what is it like to supply to some of the world's largest organizations. Where do suppliers see the challenges? Where do they think the opportunities for improvement are? I think it's fair to say that a lot of organizations could answer those questions or have a good sense of those for their very top tier, very small number of strategic suppliers. But without going all the way down into the long tail, there's this sort of big mass in the middle, if you like, of suppliers who are hugely important. In their opinion and their experience is not totally well understood, or not very well understood at all. And given that we're implementing all this change, and organizations are buying all this technology, a lot of which is directly used by suppliers or impacts on the working relationship, it's kind of funny that we're not asking. So that was the background. And so we did something about it. So earlier on this year, we conducted a survey of 500 suppliers, and the stipulation was that they must be a supplier to at least $1 billion organization in a number of sectors across various manufacturing and services sectors. And that in answering the questions, they should be thinking about one of their $1 billion plus customers. And we wanted to dig into pain points and challenging, understand what's working, what's not. We took a lot of effort to obviously ensure anonymity, to make sure it was anonymous.
I've never managed to pronounce that myself either, so no worries.
Not today. Yeah. Because obviously it's important to get the unvarnished truth. You ask suppliers, how's your customer? They're all going to say great, right? Because it's their customer. So it was important that it was anonymous because we really wanted to get to the unvarnished truth, and that's what we did. And as a side point, I think, and we may get to this, is in the course of doing this, we obviously speak to large organizations all the time, and we found that a lot of enterprise brands wanted to find this information out for themselves. And so even before we launched the study, there was a keen interest in the findings. So that's what it's about and why we did it. It occurred to me, Nico, as we were preparing, that it might be quite good at this point just to invite some comments from anybody listening. And I'd love to know, and we can discuss it at the end, and it's just kind of general sort of feedback is, has anybody on the call conducted any kind of supplier survey in recent months? Was it just to your direct, just to your indirect? Was it to your most strategic suppliers only? Did you talk to the long tail? Was it about, I don't know, technology? Was it about business practice, ESG, whatever it may be? It'd be really cool to hear if anybody listening in today has actually conducted some sort of supplier survey recently, and just anecdotal comments and feedback would be really cool. And Nico, I think if we have some time at the end, maybe we can pick up on any comments that come in. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that in. Welcome any feedback on supplier surveying in general. Anyway, that's what we did, and that set up the report that we published, Nico.
No, yeah, thanks for that introduction, Ant. And just a quick plug here as well that please do send any questions that you have for any of us here. I've already seen a couple come through, but just keep firing them away because obviously we'll have time at the end for a bit of a Q&A as well. First of all, from my side, I think, and well, great that you've put that report together because there's some really interesting findings in there. And really what I wanted to dive a bit deeper into is also just kind of like the ways in which we kind of set suppliers up for success, I guess. So I think one of the key stats that stuck to my mind from that report was that 61% of suppliers who you surveyed there said that they do find it challenging to do their best work for their most important big customers. And many of the pain points that the respondents in that survey kind of highlighted stem from just the sheer number of systems that suppliers have to interact with to really to be able to serve their customers, and just that overall kind of complexity surrounding the supplier onboarding programs, for example. So I wanted to get your views here, Manny. I know that you kind of, based on the introduction that you gave already, and I know that you kind of are trying to solve this topic already in your role, I guess could say that is close to your heart. So what are your reflections on these statistics here that I mentioned, and kind of are you, I guess, surprised by that? Why do you think, generally speaking, that it is such a challenge for suppliers to kind of go through all of that onboarding and kind of go through the RFPs and all of that usual stuff? So just your reflections, Manny, on the challenge that we're discussing here today.
Yeah, so I'm not at all surprised with this survey result. Okay, so if I look at the report deeper, it also says, and on average, a supplier has to log in 8.4 systems per customer for one customer, right? So I did a survey 5 years back when we set up this project around digital supplier interaction. So I had similar statistics from our suppliers. The pain point was around communication, visibility, and growth. So the main reason for most of the organizations, in general, was like we were all digitizing processes in silos, so adapting to the technology maturity available at that time. So not thinking about end-to-end on the internal user journey as well as the supplier journey. So if you just multiply the sheer number 8.4 with the different customers, you can imagine the complexity, the challenge that faces a supplier. So also when we launch a new way of working, leveraging digital, it's introducing, new complexities, right? So when it is introduced to suppliers by any organization, they feel there is a new tool with a lot of data requirements administrative tasks pushed to them, and that creates further complexity. So if we do not involve them upfront onto the change, clarify our overall strategy, vision, where we will land by when, they all feel lost. So I think this is precisely, addressing the pain point, right? Why suppliers generally think about a challenge when the customers are actually approaching them with multiple tools, multiple technologies, to manage the multiple business processes. It's a quite common view from suppliers, which I can reflect here.
There we go. I got stuck with my mute button there for a second, but thanks very much for that, those reflections, Manny. I think, yeah, definitely as we kind of based on the conversations that I've heard as well, obviously procurement is very much expanding its scope on kind of the strategic projects that it works with, kind of corporation-wide, really focusing on sustainability and resilience and those kind of things. So obviously that just adds to the challenge and adds to the sheer volume of information that is being requested from suppliers. So yeah, definitely a challenge. Rich, what are your thoughts on there? Like what's been kind of your experience with, helping companies navigate this, and then just as on the kind of buyer side as well, your reflections on this, any kind of anecdotes that you might have heard from the supplier side that might then kind of help us solve some of these challenges, any kind of pain points that come to mind from your end?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, it's quite a statistic, isn't it? That's a lot of wasted value really for organizations, and procurement tries so hard to get the best deal up front, but then 61% of suppliers are saying they can't do the best work for those organizations. Then a lot of that effort's being wasted. So I think there's not really, I don't feel there's enough being done to reduce complexity in a lot of organizations. I think in some cases if digitization isn't done right, then actually that can make things worse. Take something like a supplier onboarding process where you have a sort of a one-size-fits-all approach, and there's the process design is really a bit of a checkbox exercise covering off some risk points that have been brought up over the last 6 to 12 months. And I think that can be really difficult. The process design, user experience, that type of thing doesn't extend to the supplier. You may think about how it is for your internal teams to use it. You might not even think about that, but for suppliers that process can be painful. I've sat on calls with suppliers to run through that process. Sometimes it's 30, 40, 50 minutes to fill out a form. These things not intuitive, not easy to use, sometimes just not relevant to the service being provided. So yeah, I think things like that could be massive improvement around that side. Information requests. So during COVID, we saw a lot of information required to understand our positions around the supply base, and often quite knee-jerk, asking for complex information, pushing that to all suppliers, and then everyone's doing the same thing. And again, that information, you maybe use it for one report, maybe use it for a month or so, but then it becomes stale. And that's a massive overhead on suppliers when they could be focusing actually on providing real value to you. So yeah, I think there's definitely improvements to be made there. We need to be doing more of the valuable work and spending time on planning out the relationship and co-creating strategies with suppliers rather than just pushing out all these information requests onto them. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely relevant points there. Anthony, what are your reflections on this? Why do you think, from your viewpoint, that this complexity challenge really persists still today?
Yeah, I think it continues to persist because of the inherently complicated nature of working with suppliers. Without getting too philosophical, I always think it's interesting that unlike, say, customers, like if you think of a large organization, relatively few people within a manufacturing company will actually work with customers directly, obviously sales and some service people. But with suppliers, pretty much everybody in the organization touches suppliers in some way or other. Obviously, your procurement, supply chain, finance from an AP perspective, legal, compliance, quality, product risk, and then all the business users, right? So everybody is interacting with suppliers, and each of those teams, I think, has is likely to have a different type of interaction. They need to support that, or that relationship, the communications and the transactions that have got to go on. Now, all of that drives what we've already mentioned, which is requirements for digitalization. Right? Procurement, as we all know, is ripe for digitalization, has been for some time. So as a consequence, there's been this explosion in technology. And a lot of that technology is designed to work with suppliers, or actually for suppliers to work with directly. And everyone's familiar now with best of breed. Like 2 years ago, I think in the procurement world, best of breed was a sort of relatively new term. Everyone knows it now. Everyone's kind of bored of hearing about it. But what it means is, individual software applications that are really good at addressing one aspect of the relationship, or one business process, or one or two use cases, which is terrific. There's tons of value that comes out of that. And Rich alluded to this, is there are downsides of this much needed digitalization, right? One of them is data, and HICX talks a lot about this because that's kind of in our DNA and our sort of our core capabilities around supplier data. And we've talked about it a lot, but the other is the complexity it creates for suppliers, and they have to log into multiple systems, got to enter the same information potentially multiple times. And the other point, which I don't think is touched on very often, is that they've got to figure out themselves is which information is applicable to them. Right? Companies tend to broadcast, say, well, I put it up on the website, or I've sent an email. But each individual supplier knows that not everything that is spat out or is produced by the buying organisation, their customer, not all of it's relevant to them. They've got to then figure out which subset is relevant to me. And to Rich's point, that's not value-added work. So why does it persist? Because it's really hard. Suppliers are complicated. There's tons of different people working with them. Lots of people impact on the data. Lots of different systems involved. So I think that's why. I think the final point I had on this quickly is nobody owns the supplier relationship end to end. If I go back to the customer parallel, you could argue that someone with a sales comp target, or someone in sales or account management, kind of owns the end-to-end customer relationship, and at least cares about what it's like to buy from, whether it's a consumer-facing organisation or a buyer-facing organisation. They get it. They care. You even have this concept of a mystery shopper, right? People going and say, what's it really like? But within the world of supplier, nobody owns that. Procurement's kind of closest. Adam Brown, actually, it's mentioned in the report. Adam talks about, likens it to a relationship between people, right? That procurement sort of owns the first couple of dates. It gets us to a point where there's an approved supplier, there's a contract, there's necessary certificates. But what about the rest of life? What about the rest of the marriage that follows? Who owns that? Who cares about the friction and the multiple data entry points, the redundancy, and all of that? And nobody owns it. So if I think about, why do we still have this? As I say, I think it's the supplier. The nature of supplier is complex, but the lack of that ownership is hugely important in my view.
And what's always so striking to me about this challenge as well is that, I'm sure that there must have been overlap in your survey as well, with suppliers responding to your questions with their supplier hats on. But then the same companies also are customers, buyers for a lot of different other organizations. So then it's the exact reversal there. So certainly those findings will be beneficial for the suppliers themselves as well. But it's just always interesting that companies aren't necessarily that good at connecting the dots between, procurement and sales guys, for example, getting together in sharing the best practices and kind of learning from each other. But that's different strand of conversation, I guess. But just going deeper into one of the keywords that came up in your previous points there was communication. So like figuring out the right questions to ask from suppliers, for example. And I think some of the data points from the report highlight this as well. So 60% of suppliers say that they do spend too much time on admin when serving their most important customer. And I'm pretty sure that if you just were a bit more concise and to the point with the questions that you're asking your suppliers, you actually reduce that time spent on suppliers. Also, 47% of the respondents said that they do struggle to get their inquiries solved. So this whole topic of communication just generally seems to be quite a significant pain point for customers, even more so than issues like, on-time payments and these kind of things. So just wanted to bring you, Manny, here back on the conversation. why do you think this really is kind of, if you want to maybe elaborate a bit on the challenge when it comes to communications and asking the right kinds of questions, and then more so, how are you in your role really kind of overcoming these challenges, and any kind of top tips for people to, take away from your experience?
Yeah, I think good that, Nico, you touched about it as well as Anthony on two different elements, right? So procurement organization is evolving as we speak. We are moving beyond, management of cost or supplier into topics like sustainability, cybersecurity, and whatnot, right? So constantly we are evolving, and this is driving new initiatives upstream with the suppliers, which is requesting a lot of data and information from suppliers, right? So communication, I see it as a major pain point for suppliers. Like Anthony mentioned, there are not one single organization, which interfaces with suppliers and trying to consolidate all the communication and send it to the specific persona with the supplier. So in my experience, I think the suppliers, what they would like to have is two-way communication and one control center, to get the visibility on all those interactions, what they need to act, when, with whom. This is why we set up a digital interaction platform that manages this two-way communication and also provides visibility on interaction around end-to-end business process, because we always try to do everything in silos, like an RFQ process or a contract process or a invoicing process, but it's not going to work, right? So getting the one connected end-to-end on the different business processes which we engage with suppliers with various persona, because you have different personas in front of your suppliers. Not the same persona is, interacting in all the different processes. So how do you actually manage this and segment it and drive them towards a single entry point? No, this is something which has been well appreciated, in our experience with our suppliers. And on the organization front, because we are more discussing on the technology side, but on the organization front, we need to probably change ourselves, how we organize ourselves in front of suppliers, be it communication or be it managing the different business processes across the source to pay. So how do we set up resources around supplier onboarding, massively, communicating suppliers and reacting or responding to their needs, because it's not one-way communication. I want to stress this point of two-way communication, right? And harmonizing the relationship, segmenting the approach across the different tiers, what you have in front of you, and training and supporting them and to continuously measure satisfaction, right, towards continuous improvement. This is key in terms of resolving the issues or the challenges what we face with suppliers. So today we are in the process of setting up a digital ecosystem, which is a continuous journey to enhance our overall supplier experience. So it's a point to be addressed from technology standpoint, from people standpoint, and also from organization standpoint for me.
And maybe just elaborating on that a bit, Mani, how do you then go about that resource allocation? How do you kind of figure out which suppliers do need more, I guess, premium touch from you? And the reason I wanted to ask this from you as a follow-up immediately is that I saw there was a question from the audience around how do kind of procurement business partners as a role play into this bigger picture there. So I don't know, did you have any thoughts on that question specifically, Mani?
Yeah, so when we digitize the experience with suppliers, we start with the process. So we look at the current process end to end, when we take about a specific business process, and to define the future state and looking the journey from the supplier persona. So how many different personas are going to interact with us on this particular process, from the supplier as well as from the organization touch point. And then also to segment the suppliers, you have the strategic suppliers, the core suppliers, the tactical suppliers, and the transactional suppliers. How it's not the same information you share it with everyone, right? So how do you segment, and when you communicate, what is the different level of communication you would have? And even when you do a process around a contract or an NDA or a performance management, how do you segment it differently to have something light, with the tail, and to have something more deeper with the strategy is key, right? So you cannot have the same kind of approach for the entire panel of suppliers in front. So segmenting that and then articulating it well when you design your processes and digitize the experience is a key for success.
Yeah, thanks, Mani, for elaborating on that. Rich, I want to bring you in here. Before asking the question, just wanted to make a point that the the light in the room where you are is absolutely magnificent. Just amazingly beautiful background there. Just wanted to highlight that there before diving back to supplier experience. What are your thoughts on this? Have you heard any, good examples of suppliers or companies rather kind of tackling these challenges? Any kind of top tips or just findings on what really needs to be done to perhaps improve on that communication or those other admin pain points that the report really highlighted?
I mean, yeah, the admin burden, that's a big issue. It's a common challenge that we hear from suppliers. I think as well, sometimes rather than eliminating some of this overhead, the approach of some organizations can be to sort of outsource or offshore the sort of collection and that information, and that really improves things. That just sort of pushes the problem to a lower cost center. So I mean, that the 38% of suppliers saying that they have to use more than 10 systems to serve a customer is just it's crazy. And as Anthony said, some of that is because of this move to best of breed, but obviously that's pushing a big overhead onto the supply base there. I mean, in terms of what we could do, I think the communication part is vital. Anytime there's get called in and there's an issue with a supplier relationship, it's never a one-sided issue. Sometimes it can sound like it when you go in there, but often it's just a breakdown of communication between the two sides. And obviously, again, that's somewhere where lots of value can be lost through those relationship breakdowns and having to replace a supplier. And if you can catch those early and be proactive in improving that communication, then we can avoid that sort of issue. So I think definitely need to be more proactive, spend more time across the organisation forming relationships. At whatever level. I think there's a few posts recently about the amount of time that the CEO spends with some of the key suppliers, and obviously that's want to see that increasing, because the supply base is a real source of innovation. And then it's really it's down to sort of simplifying our approach, listening. As you say, the voice of the supplier surveys, that type of thing. Listening to the challenges that those suppliers are facing, and then making sure we're changing. I think change is a constant process. We need to be challenging unnecessary processes. Every sort of few months, really iterating our approach to some things, and then that will open up some of this innovation that we can tap into the supplier base, and that helps solve some of these challenges that we're facing. Sustainability, the supply chain challenges. There's lots that we can be working together to solve.
No, absolutely, and that CEO interaction, really. I mean, that has been mentioned as a just previously, in conversations, generally speaking, like as a rule of thumb for what makes for a strategic partner for an organization. Just ask yourself that, would you bring your CEO to meet this supplier's CEO? If the answer is yes, then that's probably a strategic partner that you should go for. Yeah. And that's fine, I guess. But that also, I think, Ant, you mentioned this previously, that companies know who those strategic partners are and really are investing in those kinds of relationships. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you obviously have the tailspin where it doesn't necessarily make that much sense to dive super deep into that. So I don't know, Ant, if you had any top tips for how to overall, I guess, reduce the friction, perhaps with regards to communications or otherwise, especially for that middle of the pack there between the strategic partners and the tail spend. Just any thoughts?
Yeah, Sure. I think the survey gave us some clues, but I think the first point I'd make is I don't think organisations, many, if any, nowadays, go out of their way to deliberately make this difficult. I think it's happening because they've got legacy tech, they've got bad data, and suppliers are just hard work in terms of the different types that we talked about already. So I think it is tough to fix, but I think you can, and I don't think it's rocket science. I think you start by putting yourself in the supplier's shoes, walk a mile in their shoes, actually experience what it's like to enter into a relationship. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to organise logistically, but it can't be impossible. Carmen, we speak a lot to Carmen Earhart at Henkel about this because she's a passionate believer in the topic, and she talks about actually going through a process, onboarding, trying to find someone to talk to in your organization, someone like a mystery shopper, I mentioned this earlier, try and find some information. I think you have to start there, because everyone makes assumptions about what it's like. I'm a marketer, so I'm customer facing, and I make assumptions about what it's like to interact with us, and I'm never right if I ever test it, right? You always have blind spots. And I think the survey showed you might well be surprised at what you find. And to your point, Nico, I think it has to be not just the 1% of suppliers, it has to be the volume of your suppliers, because a lot of the efficiency comes not from that 1%, but from the thousands or hundreds of thousands of interactions with the mass of your suppliers. That's where there's efficiency opportunity. What else can you do to reduce friction? Well, actually, Manny made an really interesting point, and actually something I'm really passionate about is thinking about segmentation. Procurement is typically thought about segmentation in terms of dividing up suppliers into segments to figure out what strategies to deploy to get the most from that relationship. Entirely relevant, entirely appropriate. Not all suppliers are equal. No one's suggesting anything otherwise. But there is another way to look at segmentation, which is, how do you look at the characteristics of each supplier and then tailor an experience for them? And it could be as simple as, if your supplier's in Colombia, speak to them in Spanish. If they're in France, speak to them in French. Right? Don't assume everyone speaks English. Similarly, do they all have equal access to technology? I know a lot of the companies we talk to deal directly with farmers. They don't necessarily have all the same access to technology as their tier one strategic suppliers. I mentioned already the fact that different suppliers need to consume different, or need to be aware of different policies or compliance initiatives. So if you think about segmentation as a way to tailor that and personalize that for each supplier, you'll be going a long way. Now, I know from having this conversation with procurement professionals, that sounds absolutely terrifying. What? I'm going from 8 to 80,000 segments? Are you insane? Of course not. The computer is really good at this, right? The technology is there for you to allow suppliers to express preferences and for you to group suppliers very dynamically based on whatever criteria. I want to know everything about my Argentinian suppliers. I want to know everything about my packaging suppliers, or my suppliers above X spend in Nicaragua, whatever it is. The technology's out there, and on the customer-facing side, there's lots to learn from. So I get really excited and off script when I think about segmentation. But you asked me, how do we reduce comms friction? So walk a mile in their shoes and think about how you segment would be my short answers. I think the other quick thing is, so what? Like, why should we bother? Right? And it's been implicit in the conversation so far, but I just wanted to expand on it briefly. Is, even HICX would argue that you should just be doing this because it's going to be a strategic advantage if all of your suppliers love working with you. And I can't see how there's an alternative view to that, quite honestly. I think it just makes sense. But even if you don't buy into that, even if that doesn't float your boat and you don't believe that having suppliers that love working with you is good, just think about it from the efficiency it causes on your side, or the inefficiency rather. So Rich mentioned supplier onboarding, so did you, Nico. If the supplier onboarding is a nightmare for the supplier, the chances are it's a nightmare for you as well. Chances are it's taking weeks or months to bring a supplier on board. If gathering compliance information or ESG data is horrible for them, it's probably horrible for you as well. So even if you don't care about that, and we think you should, but even if you don't, recognize that if you make it efficient for the supplier, then you're going to collect data much more quickly, more accurately. Your processes are going to be much quicker, much more efficient, and your users are going to be happier as a consequence. So I think that's why we should prioritize, fixing friction points as it relates to comms and suppliers.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. And actually, on the topic of so what, that kind of question, that important question, I'm sure that comes up in, a lot of your conversations, and obviously having to demonstrate all of that to your prospective customers, but also from that prospective customer's perspective, like from your view, Mani, how do you kind of see that, so what element, and what's your kind of, I guess, why are you seeing this topic? I mean, you've kind of alluded to a lot of these points already, but just to kind of summarize some of those key points, why people should be bothered with this kind of supplier experience improvement and looking at supplier perceptions. Why are you really looking to solve these problems, and why it's so important to you and your team? Just a few thoughts on that, please, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I think Anthony touched about it, efficiency. For me, simplification is key, for the end user. So simplification and efficiency is key for the end users from both the organizations. So we need to think about the buyer and the supplier to do the right things for our customer and environment, right? So for me, I think there is no choice. You need to ensure, because with the advancement in terms of the technology, and also on the other side with the evolution of procurement as a function and the challenge what we face, in terms of the current crisis, we don't have a choice. We need to think about our suppliers, walk through their experience, put them at the core and digitize our processes. So there's no other choice, to be successful, to be more simplified in our approach, to be more efficient in the future.
And what are perhaps some of your top tips, if you will, on how to really get started on all of this? Like, for example, on that simplification journey and that segmentation piece. Any key words of advice there?
I get this question very frequently. For me, the organizations, if they have not yet embarked on this journey, it's good that start by addressing the challenge on data, because we don't need to underestimate the challenge on the data, right? Be it vendor, product, or transactional data. So the first thing is to put some governance around data and get it under control, because when you have to bring some technology and new way of working, I think you need to get the data under control. So this is something is a prerequisite, right? So there is no discussion. For me, it's a no-go if we are not controlling the data and putting it in the right data quality, right? So then the key thing is to align the vision with your internal stakeholders, right? So Rich and Anthony talked about the different personas within your organization who interact with suppliers, starting from probably procurement, planning, people across supply chain and plans, and then from your finance team and sustainability team and cybersecurity team. So many personas within your organization interact with one supplier, right? It could be one persona in the supplier, or it could be multiple persona depending upon the size of the supplier. So think about defining a strategy and aligning the vision with your internal stakeholders facing the suppliers, how you want to, get the approach in front of your suppliers, to be more efficient on communication or to get the visibility, right? It's key to align the vision. And then everyone will have to align, because then the initiatives are not in silos, right? And while you build the new way of working, right, it could be a process or it could be a technology solution, try to onboard your suppliers upfront, to take their input and to validate their experience. Because when you're designing something for the supplier, get your key suppliers, maybe when you segment, get the few suppliers from each segment and to try and test and validate their experience before you scale up, right? And then set up an organization to drive this new way of working. Because if you have to sustain on what you deploy, set up the organization, because this is normally not existing in the organizations, right? So to work about the massive interaction with suppliers in a digital way, so set up the organization and get the user support around suppliers as well as internal users on this new way of working. So it's all about driving the change with suppliers. This is key for success.
Some really good points there. Rich, anything that you'd like to add to what Mani just walked us through?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. This efficiency. I think, as I said previously, it's about tapping into this source of innovation and value. I think we've really moved away from this approach of suppliers being some sort of commodity that you could extract as much as you can from, some zero-sum game. So I think that organizations, they're listening to their customers more. They want to build lasting relationships. I think that's that's moving to the way that we're working in procurement. And yeah, I think for procurement, there's a real benefit there of the sort of the strategic approach, how we're solving problems for our organizations using our supply base. And yeah, it's sort of, so for the procurement team, it's increasing the value to the business. We're getting greater delivery there, and it's just more exciting work. So rather than beating up suppliers, we're sort of creating value with them, which is definitely more, that's where we want to be. So yeah, that's
It definitely does sound quite exciting. I think certainly like allowing procurement to pivot to a lot of, I mentioned briefly in the beginning that like focusing on those more value-adding projects. We know from various bits of research that that's where procurement is kind of aligning itself more towards contributing to some specialist task forces within procurement, within an organization more broadly, for example, and all of what we've discussed here, kind of reducing that admin burden within those core procurement activities gets procurement one step closer to that end outcome. So yeah, I too am really excited for that development there. And maybe just your kind of wrap up on this part of the conversation before we move to the Q&A here. I know there's some really interesting questions that I want to get to, but kind of what benefits overall do you see kind of emerging in companies as they are putting their suppliers at the heart of kind of everything that they do? I know you've touched on some of this and the others have too, but just to bring us home, what's the kind of end state for procurement when these good things really start to happen within procurement?
Yeah, no, it is the $1 million question. But isn't it? I think the easiest area to measure is around efficiency, and we've talked quite a lot about that, so I won't repeat those points. But other than to say, there are thousands of processes, sort of micro processes and transactions where there's inefficiency as a consequence of not paying attention to what the supplier experiences, and that's at their side and your side. I think more softer for sure, but I think long-term more important is this idea of becoming customer of choice. And that's a little bit of a hackneyed or cliche phrase in as much as it's been around for a while, but I don't want it to become cliche. I want it to be front and center. I think it's extremely important. I can't help thinking that if I was the CEO of a very, very large, multi-billion-dollar organization, being told most of our suppliers don't view us as customer choice versus the majority of our suppliers view us as customer of choice, I know which one I'd rather be. It just feels like the right way to go right now. I know that's hard to put on a balance sheet, and the CFO is not going to sign off a business case of it just feels better. I get it. And that was why we did want in the report, and I encourage people to read it if they haven't had a chance, we did try to explore it, and I think there's a lot to do here, and we're doing more on it. But it's like, how can you try to quantify it? And there are a couple of areas. In the survey, we set up the idea of having an important customer, a very important, very big, important customer, and the implication being that, they spend a lot of money with you, versus the customer of choice. And we allowed the respondent to sort of define to themselves to some extent what customer of choice was. But once we'd sort of established those positions, we teased out what's the difference, and it was really stark. And the two stats that stand out were that, I have to get this right, but 20% more would prioritize stock for their customer of choice over what they consider to be a very important customer if stock was low in times of constraint. Right, 20% more would prioritize you. And the other one was that 24% more would go the extra mile if you were customer of choice. So this idea of being customer of choice is understood by suppliers. That was very clear from the survey. And they understand that it was different from and better than just being a really important, really big customer. And then there was this clear recognition or clear acknowledgement in the data that they go further and they do work harder. And again, you only have to look back the last 2 years when companies were screaming for PPE equipment, or if you rely on supply from Central and Eastern Europe right now, that supply gets constrained by events that were very, very difficult to predict. And you really want you to be top of the, first in line if supply is constrained, and that sort of general feeling that going the extra mile. So I think the industry, and we can help with this, I'm sure, has some way to go to be able to put some harder numbers on it. In the efficiency realm, I think it's relatively easy. But it just seems to me like a transformational, C-level issue that we just want all our suppliers doing the best for us. And this notion of customer choice, I think, is super important. So I'm excited about how we can start to put some slightly firmer numbers on that as we go forwards.
Absolutely. And just from various conversations that I've personally been involved in the recent weeks and months, like on the topic of negotiating with your suppliers, we just hear on an anecdotal basis that the traditional levers that companies are used to pulling in their negotiations with suppliers aren't necessarily working because the power balance within the supply chain has actually shifted to the supplier's benefit in many cases, especially in this current scarcity economy. So kind of very much, echoing what Ant summarized there around this customer of choice. That's not something that you can kind of build that customer of choice status on the spot on the negotiation table. You need to work beforehand to get to that. So that's certainly resonates with me. Thanks for sharing all of that, all the three of you. Wanted to bring us just to the last couple of questions that we have here from the group here. And obviously you'll remember Ant asked you to submit your thoughts on whether you are using supplier surveys and just trying to get that sentiment from your suppliers. So I just wanted to highlight one response here from a group, and there's a question attached to that I'd like to get the panelists' views on. So one person says that they're just in the process of using a 360-degree questions kind of survey to try and improve a really bad relationship with a key supplier. The trick here is that they are aware that there will be some emotional rather than evidence-based answers from the suppliers. So the question is that, do you have any advice on running a survey like this? I don't know if, and maybe if you want to elaborate on this and then get Rich and Mani's views as well.
Well, on this panel, I'm probably least qualified on the specifics of dealing with a bad supplier relationship. On the question of surveys, I think I would say, and this I think applies more generally, is to remove emotion and ask for evidence. The person asking the question kind of referred to this, but phrase the questions in a way that doesn't just say, do you like, or how was it, or to what extent. Phrase in a way that, give examples. It's like being interviewed, right? It's like a competency interview. Give examples of. And then that forces the respondent to at least try to produce something a little bit more factual and objective than just subjective. That would be, I guess, my response. But it is tricky. I totally get it. I guess time your questions. Maybe a slightly glib response as well. Wait for the dust to settle.
Makes sense. Rich, what are your thoughts on this?
I mean, it's difficult because we are dealing with the relationship. And so, in that sense, there will be emotions because it's people dealing with people, and the emotions usually, there will be an issue that sits behind the emotions and is driving those emotions. So I think obviously there's still valuable data points that you can get to the get to the sort of the root cause of what the issues are that are causing those issues. But so I mean, I've seen that. I have seen it quite a few times where you do get those sort of emotions involved. But yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing.
That's interesting to hear. Anything to add from your side, Mani?
Yeah, for me, when you run a survey, I think it's good to have the balance between, descriptive and probably objective. So you set a question in such a way, you get the most of it with some clear, predefined answers. Because when you're running a massive survey, it will be very difficult to consolidate all the descriptive answers and then to analyze, right? So you need, again, technology there to segment and see, what your supplier is talking about. But then it's important to also understand their emotions, like Rich mentioned, to see through the emotions, what were responded by the supplier. So I would say balance the questionnaire in such a way, you capture both.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks, Mani, for those thoughts. And there's certainly a lot of good takeaways from there. One thing that I was thinking throughout the presentation, throughout the discussion, really is also on the kind of topic of simplification. And one of the questions in the chat kind of resonates or links to this, but just overall, whether it's a technology question or whether it's a decision process within the category team, but just kind of dictating what are the right sets of questions to ask from different suppliers, and like how do you what's everyone's take on really kind of deciding that what kind of perhaps questions within the supplier surveys are the most important to get to? Is it driven by the overall set of KPIs that you assign for the suppliers as part of the segment, for example, or are there any tips from HICX's perspective, for example, on what the technology can kind of help you with that decision-making process there. Maybe Ant, to you first. I don't know if I was able to get anything out of that, but tried my best.
Yeah, no. Nothing springs to mind, Nico. So thanks for that. No, I suppose with any questionnaire, it's your what do you want to get from it? Like, 'cause you can ask questions forever, right? But we've been particularly focused on trying to tease out in the survey we ran, trying to tease out, do suppliers even think about the relationship and what's their perspective? We were then trying to get to actionable information as much as possible. Like, it's inherently the case that with a survey of suppliers to multiple customers, it's only going to ever be so actionable. And I would really encourage, which is why I wanted to ask the question earlier on, organizations to do surveys of their suppliers themselves. And so ask questions that you're going to do something with, look for actionable information. And then I think there's a wealth of stuff around process, right? You don't have to change the world. A lot of SRM type initiatives are all very broad, very high level, very ambitious about collaboration and joint innovation and contracts for 20 years and CEO to CEO discussions. And that's terrific at that with those relationships. But I think we can do a lot by addressing what I think is relatively basic or standard. I'm not saying it's easy. Around removing efficiencies, invoice status, payment status information, or, inquiries, where to go for inquiries, or thinking better about how you publish information and segmenting, like I talked about earlier. So in terms of best practice of how to survey, if that's kind of what I think you're asking, Nico, do something based on what you ask questions. You're going to do something with information. Don't just do it as a sort of an exercise to say we asked and we moved on. So that, I guess, would be my sort of initial response to an unplanned question.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for taking that. Just wanted to get that out of my chest, really. I think we are dangerously close to the end of the hour, so I am going to have to wrap this up. There's a lot of other interesting questions that came up, and we can get to you, whoever submitted these questions, as a follow-up as well, just as we've run out of time here. I mentioned that we're obviously very interested in hearing your feedback from this. So if you could please kindly fill out the survey questions that you can see, get access there from the platform. And then just a quick reminder that you can download the HICX's Voice of the Supplier survey from the download link on the platform as well. I think that's all. It's really been an interesting conversation. Certainly have learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone in the audience has as well. So thanks very much for Mani, Rich, and Ant for taking part today. And thanks for everyone in the audience for tuning in. I hope to see you again soon on another Procurement Leaders webinar. Hope everyone has a great rest of the day, and see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.